It is an honor and a privilege to welcome to the program Jonathan D. Sarna. He is the author of When General Grant Expelled the Jews. Jonathan D. Sarna is the Joseph H. and Belle R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University and Chief Historian of the National Museum of American Jewish History. Jonathan, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
A pleasure to be with you. Thanks.
Jonathan, this is a great short insight, your book that is, into American history at the time of the Civil War and during the Grant administration. I urge my listeners to read this, even though most of my listeners are not Jewish. They may not know about the particulars of the general order that General Grant issued during the Civil War. The book gives great insight into what life was like at that time. But specifically, would you introduce and talk a bit on this famous event that is widely known amongst Jews, but is not as well known amongst Americans generally?
Sure. In December of 1862, General Grant, who was moving south, was deeply worried about smuggling. He, of course, felt that, and rightly, that smuggling was harming the Union cause. But where he made a mistake was in his belief that all of the smugglers were Jews. Indeed, to his mind, those words were synonymous. And on December the 17th, 1862, he issued really the most anti-Semitic order in all of American history, in which he expelled Jews from the entire area under his command, which was at that time the Army of the Tennessee, and gave them 24 hours to leave. And there were quite a number of Jews in that area. Memphis had one of the largest Jewish communities in the South. He thought that by expelling the Jews, he would put the problem of smuggling to rest. Now, fortunately, for Jews, soon after he issued that order, his army was attacked, and as part of those attacks, the telegraph lines were cut, and so the order actually spread very slowly. And that's why not nearly as many Jews were actually expelled as one might have expected just by reading the order. But there were places, most notably Paducah, where all Jews, whether they supported the Union, the Confederacy, whether they were involved in peddling or were involved in some other business, were told that they were ordered out of the territory within 24 hours. Fortunately, one of those ordered out of Paducah, his name was Caesar Caskell, and he was a staunch Union supporter, decided to appeal all the way to Abraham Lincoln. And he leaves Paducah. He takes trains night and day to get to Washington. He runs off to see a congressman who had access to the White House, and he gets in to see Lincoln. And of course, Lincoln didn't know anything about this order. He'd never seen it. The telegraph lines were cut. No copy had reached Washington. But Lincoln, according to tradition, has this wonderful conversation with Caskell, in which he says, "And so the children of Israel were driven from the happy land of Canaan." And Gaskell replies, "Yes, and that is why we have come unto Father Abraham's bosom, asking protection." And Lincoln says, "And this protection they shall have at once," even if the conversation didn't exactly go that way. We do know that Lincoln instantly ordered that General Orders Number 11 be revoked.
And you also have in there language from Lincoln which shows that he basically said, look, because of a couple of sinners, a couple of bad apples, you don't issue an order expelling an entire people. That obviously Lincoln understood how un-American that was, and plus Grant used a particularly offensive term, expelling Jews, quote, as a class, as opposed to expelling smugglers who were both Jewish and non-Jewish in his district. And this sort of overreaction on the part of General Grant is difficult to understand, because it doesn't appear that Ulysses Grant was anti-Semitic himself, and it also generally Grant was known to be somewhat probative and sober, at least in his military decisions. What was going on in Grant's mind at the time that he issued this order?
So that's a wonderful question. And as part of the research for the book, I uncovered the fact that Grant's own father had really cooked up a scheme with some Cincinnati Jewish merchants, and his father's name was Jesse Grant, and the merchants were the Macks, and they cooked up a scheme whereby cotton would be transported east. Jesse would get a permit from his son, and the Macks would sell it for a high profit, and Grant would get a percentage of those profits. When Ulysses saw that, wow, his own father, with whom he had a complicated relationship, his own father was involved in smuggling and with Jews, he had a temper tantrum, according to an eyewitness, and he expelled Jews on the spot. I fully agree. It was uncharacteristic of Grant, and I think there's a lot of evidence that Grant later regretted that order. In fact, when he wrote his wonderful memoir, it's a fabulous book, Grant's Memoirs, but he doesn't mention General Order Number 11 at all, and that's not an accident. According to his son, who worked with him, Grant wrote the memoirs. He was dying at the end of his life, and his son said, "Shouldn't we write about General Order Number 11?" And he quoted his father as saying, "That was a matter long past and best not referred to." So he didn't say anything about it, and he tended not to refer to things that were embarrassing. His wife, in her memoir, which is less read, but she wrote a memoir as well, she did mention the order, and fascinatingly, she characterizes it as, quote, obnoxious, and claims that Grant thought that the reprimand he got was deserved. He had no right to make an order against any special sect. In any case, as president, he went out of his way to appoint Jews to office and to be concerned about the rights of Jews, almost as if he spent the years after 1862 atoning for that order and wanting to make sure that his reputation was not tarnished by it. And that explains why when he dies, Jews are prominent among those who mourn him. He's mourned in synagogues. Jews march in the parade and so on, demonstrating that they knew that he had atoned for that order. But nevertheless, we do have this outrageous order in the middle of the Civil War, and one can imagine how the American Jewish community was frightened that such an order had been issued. Sure.
Okay, my guest is Jonathan Sarna. The book is When General Grant Expelled the Jews. Jonathan, as you say, I mean, Ulysses Grant did seem to try to make atonement for this sin the rest of his political career. And in fact, he, based on what I've read in your book, I think that one could say that he presided over one of the most pro-Jewish administrations in history. Not only that, but besides appointing Jews to high office, and, he also was the first president, possibly one of the first leaders in modern times, to involve human rights issues in his foreign policy, in that he criticized the Tsar's government. And we should point out that Tsar Alexander II, who was quite progressive in many ways, was an ally of the United States during the Civil War, one of the few. Actually parked ships in New York and San Francisco harbors to prevent the British and the French from getting in on the side of the Confederacy. And yet Grant, as president, criticized him publicly for the Kishinev pogrom. And the result was that Alexander pulled back. So, in a sense, he patented this concept that a nation, particularly the United States, being one of the great exceptional nations of the world, could enter in an element of human rights and of moral probity into the foreign policy equation. It wouldn't just be a matter of dealing with diplomacy and letting nations do whatever they want.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was very new at that time. His own Secretary of State was none too pleased by these humanitarian impulses, but Grant made sure that the petitions that Jews sent got wide publicity, and indeed, the interesting thing was that the Russians essentially charged Jews with the same crime Grant had charged them with years earlier. That is, they charged Jews with smuggling and unreliable and so on. And yet this time, Grant really came down hard against them. And one should add that when Jews were severely persecuted during his administration in Romania, once again, stood by them.
Okay, we have a brief break here. Jonathan Sarna is my guest. 62. Thank you. He then runs for president in 1868, and as a Republican, and the Democrats bring up this issue including to the Jewish community, which of course indicates that Jews at that point were viewed as potentially a swing vote in a general election. And they did so with with both fists. I mean, they really went after Grant as a Haman and, comparing him to the most villainous figure in Jewish history at that time, including a speech that you recount, a campaign rally, I think it was in St. Louis, where there was literally, it was suggested that General Grant end up in the same way that Haman ended up in the book of Esther, which of course was in the gallows. Could you comment on that atmosphere?
Yeah, I have to say that I myself was surprised. I knew that 19th century elections were rowdy, but until I did the research, I had not realized the extent to which what was still a rather small Jewish community, maybe a couple 100,000 Jews across the country, was nevertheless being wooed by both parties, and that so much attention would be paid. A reminder that in America elections are close and every vote counts, but ethnic politics, which we sometimes imagine is a 20th century invention, was alive and well in 1868, and indeed they weren't always polite, as you say. Some Democrats were happy to suggest that a Grant be hung from a tree like Haman was, and the temperature of that campaign was very high. The Democrats really thought that this General Order Number 11 was a way of undermining the credibility and the aura that surrounded Grant, who, of course, was seen by many Americans as the greatest hero, right up there with George Washington, for having saved the Union. And this order was and publicizing it was an attempt to besmirch his image. But in the end, Grant won.
The Jewish community seems somewhat divided in that you quote prominent Jewish figures like Rabbi Wise and others as supporting, and some oppose, and Simon as supporting, and some as opposing Grant. What was generally the I don't know, I guess you might say the political makeup, if there was any to be discerned, of the Jewish community in the 1860s?
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating, because today 70% or so of all American Jews are supposedly Democratic, but in that period, Jews were pretty evenly divided, and you really see not just lay Jews, ordinary Jewish voters, but even Jewish leaders deeply divided as to whom to support, and you had very significant people on both sides insisting that the Jewish thing to do was either to support Grant, and that was the Republican view, and after all, Grant was the representative of the party that included African Americans and that had a benevolent attitude toward the ex-slave. And then there were those who said, how can you vote for a General Grant? He expelled Jews. To vote for him is to betray your religion, your people. And you should instead vote for the Democrats, regardless of the fact that some of the Democrats at that time really argued that African Americans shouldn't be allowed to vote. And
sure. Jonathan, you bring up in the book this old canard that has been leveled against Jews, leveled against me recently on this program by a guest who called himself an Islamist, and that is the question of dual loyalties. I mean, this idea that somehow one is not a loyal American if one's loyal as a Jew or loyal to or supporting of the state of Israel. And in the book, you have a great debate between two rabbis in the election of 1868, Rabbis Adler and Wise, where you quote Isaac Mayer Wise as addressing this great conundrum. Could you comment on that a bit?
Isaac Mayer Wise was not shy about defending himself, and he argued that it's impossible to make two Isaac Mayer Wises, one who is a citizen and the other who is a Jew, and that indeed what he brings is both his Judaism and his patriotism to the voting booth. And really, I think, undermined that notion of a dual loyalty, and pointing out that in America, loyalty means that you are loyal to American principles, but it certainly doesn't preclude your bringing your own religious background inside the voting booth with you. Rabbi Liebman Adler, totally disagreed and went so far as to say, well, if Grant is Haman, he would vote for Haman when he goes in the voting booth, even if the Jew in him mourned. He, in the voting booth, only voted as an American, as if one could shed one's religious and ethnic background when one entered that voting booth. Isaac Mayer Wise couldn't have disagreed more.
Well, I mean, certainly the whole idea of loyalty to religious and ethnic background is in and of itself an American principle, and that Judaism has the happy coincidence of embracing principles within its own faith that are more than just consistent with American principles, but in fact are the very font of American principles. So in that sense, it's really virtually impossible to have dual loyalties, because loyalty to Judaism is loyalty to America. You have a great passage in here when President Grant was the first president to visit a synagogue, and the dedication of Adas Israel. What a scene that is. You're a great writer. I mean, you really bring the reader right into the event, and it's an extraordinary accomplishment. Could you talk a bit on that?
Yeah, I'm delighted to do so. Adas was really the first synagogue to be built as a synagogue. Before then, Jews just rented rooms, and it's dedicated in 1876, which is the very end of Grant's term, and we're getting very near the centennial of America, July the 4th, 1876. And Grant, to the great joy of the congregation, even though it was rather small, it still exists today. You can go and see it in Washington, that little building. He announced that he was coming, and no president had ever attended a synagogue dedication before.
Okay, we'll be right back. One more brief break here. Jonathan Sarna is my guest when General Grant expelled the Jews. We'll be right back. Thank you very much. And my guest is Jonathan Sarna. He is the author of When General Grant Expelled the Jews. Jonathan, bring us back to the Adas Israel scene with President Grant attending the dedication.
So President Grant announces that he's coming to this dedication, the first time that it ever happened, that a president attended the dedication of a synagogue, and he makes sure to bring his son, Ulysses Jr., so he'll see it, and the acting vice president comes, and they don't just put in an appearance, even though it was a hot Washington day, and in those days there was no air conditioning. Ulysses S. Grant stayed for the entire dedication, 3 hours, and listened to the sermon, and then he actually made a contribution to the synagogue. He gave $10, which doesn't sound like much today until you realize that was the equivalent of $200 back in the 1870s, and this established a pattern that in America, politicians and even the president will join in dedicating synagogues and houses of worship, even if it's not the house of worship that they personally worship in. All are under the American umbrella.
Grant was also the president who signed an executive order recognizing Christmas as a national holiday. And so he did a lot of things symbolically to support religion. After the presidency, Ulysses Grant embarks upon a world tour that was unprecedented at the time, and it was kind of a quasi-diplomatic tour as well, in that he met with heads of state around the world: Europe, Asia, Japan, China. He also made a stopover in Palestine. He wrote about this, but I don't think that, from what I gather, his letters have not, even to this day, been made public. What do you know about that? What was his experience in Palestine? What was his thoughts about it?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Of course, steam travel was new.
We got one more break here. Sorry about that, Jonathan. We have to take a quick break. Sarna, the book is When General Grant Expelled the Jews. We're talking about, at this point, President Grant's post-presidential years and his trip around the world, particularly his visit to Palestine. Please continue, Jonathan.
So I was saying that General Grant took this trip because steam now made it possible to really travel safely around the world, and he definitely wanted, as others did, to stop off in the Holy Land and to see the sacred sites. In the official writings, that's what they talk about. But sometimes it's good to read the correspondence, the private correspondence, from which one learns that poor Grant had a very unpleasant trip, largely because there was a big snowstorm, which is rare in Jerusalem. 6 inches of snow would make news even today. And back in the 1870s, 6 inches of snow just buried the city, and so poor Grant had to travel around in rain and snow and very unhappy conditions. But the truth of the matter is he did see lots of holy sites, and his wife, in her book, in her memoirs, she describes at length all of the Christian sites and what they meant to them, and so forth. But as I say, in private letters, he made it clear that he was rather happy to leave, largely because the weather was so horrible.
Certainly his contemporary, Mark Twain, who also toured Palestine, wrote some rather graphic images of a region that was depopulated, poor, desert-like, and swampy, and generally very backward, a real back-burning place. I mean, was any of that also evident in Grant's observations?
Yeah, you're talking about Mark Twain's book, Innocents Abroad, a great book. And Grant and Mark Twain were friendly, and my sense is that he saw many of the same things as Grant, as Clemens, as Mark Twain had before him. Certainly, the land that he saw was tremendously undeveloped, primitive, full of peasants, really, who eked out a living, and he did meet Jews there as well. But many of them were there as part of religious missions, living off charity. This was before you began to see Jews who were trying to transform the land. At the very end of Grant's life, there are people involved in transforming the land whom he gets to know. But the Holy Land that he saw was pretty well the Holy Land lots of people saw in the 19th century, and that's why they considered it a desolate place. And when the Zionist movement wanted to bring Jews back there, they thought that this was a splendid way to save persecuted Jews who faced annihilation, really, in Eastern Europe.
Yes. Jonathan, what would you say would be the, in a nutshell, the legacy of Ulysses Grant vis-a-vis the Jews, both as a Civil War leader and as president?
Yeah, what amazed me really is here's a man who certainly made a mistake, but who transformed himself from an enemy to a friend, from a general who expelled Jews as a class to a president really who embraced Jews as individuals. The story of Grant is a man who learned from his mistakes, and if he had been prejudiced, like a lot of people were during the Civil War, he was not prejudiced thereafter.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank Jonathan Sarna for joining me, the author of When General Grant Expelled the Jews. Jonathan, I cannot more highly recommend this book. I enjoyed it. I couldn't put it down. It gives great insight. It's an enjoyable read. It's a short read. Gives great insight into what life was like generally in the United States at the mid part of the 19th century, specifically what Jewish life was like. And you also, I think, create a very good general understanding of American Judaism as being a group of people who are positive and jubilant and very pro-American, very patriotic, people who believed in this country maybe even more than other Americans, to the degree that they appreciated the very nature of American freedom because of the adversarial experiences in the old world. So, you convey that, and you do it very well, and I congratulate you for doing it.
Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you.